Garth Russell on 12:33 ABC Newcastle.
Right now we're talking education, and as your kids might be heading to school for the first time this year, I wonder if you've been the issue of the popular debate between choosing between private and public education. Faith-based schools is something you've talked about, I dare say it is. The AGS has released a report on the costs based on regional New South Wales and in primary school alone. The difference between a public and a private spending is around $74,000. So is it worth it? David Roy is a lecturer in school education at the University of Newcastle. He joins us now. David Roy, thank you so much for your time.
Good morning, guys. Good to be here.
There are so many aspects when it comes to choosing education, as I've read in the last couple of days. Preparing students or preparing kids for school is one of the important ones. But what have you learned about the difference between public and private?
Well, there's not a lot of difference, I would argue, in the teaching. Teachers are all trained the same way at universities. At the University of Newcastle, you don't have a independent or Catholic school training, you have teacher training. I guess the big difference is often in the resources the school has to support the learning and the ethos within the school, where they have a control to maybe change teachers much easier, or that there's a culture in the school which is more productive towards learning, purely because the families who go to a Catholic or an independent school are paying to do that, so they are culturally more invested in the school. So that can create a different atmosphere, but there's no real difference within the outcomes for the kids at the end of the day. Kids will learn despite schools, whether it be public, Catholic or independent.
So we're talking, and obviously NAPLAN tests have been very much the order of the day in the last few years. Are we talking those sort of indicators?
Well, it's actually even talking about going on to university and higher education. There is data out there that suggests that because kids in public schools, I guess they don't see it as much as a privilege to go to university as the expectation in some other sectors, that often they do better at the university level, but it's kind of negligible. I guess it's down to a family choice about where do they feel their kid is best going to thrive. And can they afford to send them to an independent school? Australia is quite unusual. We have a significantly high percentage of children going to private and Catholic schools, particularly at the secondary level. In many other similar kind of countries, in America and the UK, the level of private schooling is around about 5%. Here we're about 35% if you include the Catholic sector.
Yes.
And that makes for a very different setup within the system, and the arguments to say defund and get rid of them would have a massive implication, because people forget, well, hold on, 35% of families are in these schools, 35% of teachers are in these schools. So to have that kind of blanket, we must get rid of them or defund them, is a very negative approach and could be quite harming to our prosperity as a nation. So I think there's other ways we need to look at this.
We're talking about funding there. Obviously, the federal and state governments look at those statistics and go, well, only 65% generally of schools children are in the public system. Do you think that determines the funding that we get from governments?
Well, I think
what comes first, the funding or the numbers? I
think the funding comes first, linked to the numbers, because politicians are very worried about losing votes.
Yeah.
And the arguments that we should cut the funding to some schools, I don't think really works, because all you're doing is penalising children and teachers. What we maybe need to do is just increase the funding to the public. If we kind of equaled that funding by raising it rather than doing a negative aspect, then parents would have a real choice to say, well, is it worth sending my kid to a Catholic or a private school for a different reason if everything is equalised that way? But it's a difficult issue, because as a nation we have to decide what we invest in. And at the moment, education, although they talk about it, isn't what we invest in when you look at the size of the budgets and where it's all spent in the nation.
And when you look at the size of the budgets that are needed for private education over the length of a child's schooling, it's the figures are just phenomenal.
It is, but we've also got to remember that it's cheaper if you're going to a Catholic or a private school in rural areas of Australia than it is in, say, the big metropolitans of Victoria and Sydney, where a lot of these statistics have come from. If you wanted to, say, send your kid to Macquarie College in the Newcastle area, you're kind of talking of an annual fee of around $8,000 for secondary, which is not a significant takeout of a family budget. So these options are there. Again, I think it always comes down to is what is best for your kid, what is best for your family circumstances. And we can't forget that there are an increasing number of families actually choosing to homeschool. Public education has increased by about 1.1% in the past year. Catholic education by 0.9%. Private schools has gone up by about 2% of enrolment. Homeschooling has gone up by 12%. So there's a move towards that. But that in itself has a significant cost on families, because if you homeschool, there's absolutely no educational funding support from any government body. It's
been great to have this discussion. We could talk for hours, but thank you so much for your time this morning, David Roy. Appreciate it. Good on you. Lecturer in School of Education at the University of Newcastle. That's David Roy on 12:33. It's 7:28.